like showing up and just being there is the impact in a very powerful way. And there's something similar to parents, right? I think we can obviously parents are super busy, lot going on, a good parenting app, you got to love that, all that. And yet I feel like sometimes it's the inefficient time that probably makes the most difference.
All right. I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independent Center and a former marketing professor.
I'm Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and as parents. Hey, everyone. And we are joined today by Dan Vallone, and Laura's going to give us a brief bio, and then we're going to jump right in. So thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited about this conversation. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Dan. And just a little bit about Dan's background. He was formerly the U.S. Director of More in Common, but now he does some consulting with a wider group of philanthropists and private organizations, public organizations on depolarization. And he also blogs, or whatever we're calling it, Substack, here on Army 250. And so he's also a veteran and does some really interesting writing on kind of the intersection of veterans and democracy strengthening. And so I've been so fascinated to hear Dan's perspective on how those things interact and affect each other and support each other. And I'm really excited for this conversation. And so is this cat. So
Hey, all right. Yeah.
We promise animal and kid bombs on this podcast. So apologies if someone just wanders
Yeah.
the script.
so far, it's only me. I'm not sure what that means.
Well, I'm usually safely in my work office. So Dan, to kick it off, what originally drew you to bridging work? Was there a single experience that got you thinking more about the need to do bridging work, or a sort of moment that got you interested, or was it a more gradual process, or how did that work?
Yeah, sure. And first, thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've been so excited to see this whole kind of conversational space build out, and just following the work that both of you do individually and kind of collectively to just bring a different perspective on politics and society in America today. So my path to depolarization and bridge building work really started a couple years after I transitioned out of the Army. So I served as an infantry officer for 6 years in the Army. And then a few years after I left active duty, I was working in New Hampshire, and there were two different events that led me to think about a career path that was focused on polarization. The first was I was starting to get active in the veterans community, and just that's a unique space in American civil society, but it is a space that still really brings veterans and military family members and non-veterans of all different backgrounds and views together to work on. We were focused on trying to provide the immediate need that a veteran in crisis, of any kind of crisis, might need: food, housing, mental health, job security, transportation, et cetera. It was about the kind of direct needs. But still, the folks behind our organization came from all different backgrounds, all different political views, and all of that. We didn't leave it aside, but we prioritized kind of a shared sense of mission, a shared identity. So that was happening in New Hampshire. And then on the professional space, I was part of a team that was brought in to consult with a community group. I was trying to improve a school system in one of the larger cities in New Hampshire. And the group was really committed from the get-go. Like, this can't be lost to partisan politics. Like, a school system has to, and the city is a very interesting, ideologically diverse kind of city. And so it really needed to have buy-in from folks from across the political spectrum, from all the different dimensions of demography and positioning in life, if it had any hope of succeeding, because this was like a genuine 5 to 10 year plan. And so you needed school boards to build into it. And so we worked on that for 18 months, and it did succeed. Like, we got a unanimous resolution from the school board to adopt a new strategic plan for the district, and then it kind of scaffolded up to a whole set of programs And so there was this very practical experience of like, what does it look like in, this was kind of 2018, 2019 space. What does it look like to actually bring Americans together to do concrete work that addresses, education is a political issue, but what does it look like to make progress on that? That requires folks who have different views about what progress should look like to compromise, to come together, to figure things out. So those two events kind of put me on the path to say like, oh, I want to do more of this. I really enjoyed it. I find it really rewarding. I think we need more of it. And I fortunately was able to kind of find my way to more in common after that consulting gig, and worked, led that for 5 years, and could talk more about that. But that was basically the on-ramp for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Quick follow up. One of the things I love about what you pointed to is the sort of when you have a really pressing issue and you know that you need a solution. I think a lot of times we miss this really important, and this is something I think a lot about in my sort of more theoretical work, is political pluralism isn't just sort of a nod to like getting people together and like holding hands, right?
Yes.
But the reality is like real solutions are lost when we engage in this like ultra partisan, deeply polarized kind of debates. Like we miss opportunities to solve real life problems, to make people's lives better. And so I don't think it's any accident that like your experience happened on the local level where people could sort of come together and know each other and get over those partisan divides. But it does strike me that like I think a lot of the conversations that we have about the importance of political pluralism, I don't think we emphasize enough the fact that like it's not just a nice thing to have, it's absolutely crucial to solution finding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
1,000%. And I think that that's one of the misconceptions that, and folks in the field, I think for all good intentions, can sometimes lean too much into like, oh, we need to be nicer to each other. Or if we understood a kind of a shared humanity, that I'm not saying we shouldn't, like I'm not advocating for us to be meaner to one another, but it really is about it is about solving problems. And the process through which we solve problems, it turns out that we have to compromise. And then we discover like, wow, if I want to advance more of what I care about, it actually benefits if I understand what you care about. And like maybe we work together, maybe we collaborate, because I know that the process is going to ultimately, work to my advantage sometimes, you might win sometimes, and you commit to this process that we call democracy or constitutional republic. It is rooted in solving problems.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this because the idea of understanding other people's intentions and perspectives is actually how we coordinate behavior. And so when you have some task or goal that you're sharing, right, like that's what allows you to understand different people and coordinate your behavior with them. And polarization is kind of a stance that's the opposite, right? It's like, it's almost like we're committed to not understanding, which is a weird goal to have for humans, right? Because you can't cooperate or compete if you don't understand what other people's intentions are. And so it's just a weird perspective to bring. And it's amazing to me how consistently we hear from people in the pluralism space and the depolarization space, like in-person work on a problem is one of the best tools that we have to address the larger societal polarization we're looking at.
It really is. And I think you touched on two themes that have come up repeatedly in the work that I've done over the past kind of 10 years. And that's one, when folks, and this is across the political perspective, so people on the left, people on the right, when they think of the other side, the persona they have in their mind is 99% a composite of individuals who actually don't do any public policy solving, right? It is influencers. It is like this kind of amalgamation of mostly online. But it's like, it's not rooted in a city councilor who's a Democrat and who cares about advancing childcare through X, or a state legislator who's a Republican and who has a tax platform here. Those individuals, when you meet those folks who have some responsibility and some kind of meaningful role in actually tangibly like trying to put forward a solution and then being accountable for the results, they're very different than like what we think the other side actually is. And so that disconnect is easier to see when you work at the local level and you're suddenly like, oh, you're not like what I had in my mind when I thought of Democrats or Republicans.
People are so inconveniently complicated, it turns out.
Turns out. We all know that about our families. And then when you extrapolate to politics, it's like, no. People are.
Yeah. I suspect so you started your public service career in the military, and I suspect this sort of local knowledge and the need to work with people from different backgrounds. I mean, I see a clear connection there, but I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about how you, if you do see a connection between sort of how your experience in the military shaped your thinking about bridge building in American democracy and sort of where we need to go, what the connections are there.
Sure. I think this is not necessarily unique to military veteran, but it is increasingly rare, I think, in our society, which is working and serving in the military. You do build relationships with people of all different walks of life, like ideologically, demographically, from across the country. It is this, it's still not a perfect representation of the country, but it is probably the most representative institution in the nation that brings people together. And, it's increasingly true as we kind of self-sort geographically, as we kind of work in different occupational spaces, and we just less and less frequently encounter folks who have different political views or different ideological beliefs. Serving in the military, one of the reasons I think it also ended up kind of moving me towards bridge building is I just have friends who of all different political backgrounds. And so when political conversations would come up, people would put forward these, this is what Republicans are, or this is what Democrats are. I think it always kind of like, "Ooh." I know people who are not like that. Who are not like that,
Mhm.
who kind of are, who would dispel that myth. And I think that's important. Like we have to, those personal relationships are increasingly fleeting, and veterans can actually be a unique messenger to say, look, this is my experience. I've worked with people who have these beliefs, across the political spectrum, and they're not what you think or what you have in your mind. I think that's one important part. And then the second thing, veterans have long been kind of one of the anchors of civil society organizations. There's a scholar of civil society, Theda Stockpole. She chronicles this, like veterans, I think probably because you just have this instinctive drive to self-organize, have always wanted to kind of create associational spaces, oftentimes for the veteran community, going back to like the Grand Army of the Republic after the Civil War, but continuing up to the day, and increasingly reaching beyond the veteran community. So there is this kind of added benefit of harnessing veterans as bridge builders because you want to connect, you want to build these spaces where you can meet other people and you
Mhm.
want to go do things together.
Mhm. I mean, I think it's
I was
so
actually,
interesting.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
No, I was going to say, I thought one of the reasons I thought it would be really interesting to have this conversation is because Dan is a veteran and Lauren's also a
Yeah.
part of a military family through her husband. And so I'm really curious to like Lauren's perspective on how the military shapes that kind of interaction and veteran.
Well, it was actually I was just talking to Xander Keeg. I'm going to butcher his last name, but he works with Braver Angels, but he works for the VA. He's a veteran, and we were talking about one of the disconnects in American society is the increasing, sort of we're doing increasing amounts of sorting, demographic sorting, not just politically, but one of the really crucial areas of sorting is class. We no longer work like increasingly, white collar workers are totally separate from blue collar workers. There's really very little sort of connection across classes. In my town, there's like an east side of Rochester and a west side of Rochester, and like there's a very clear class divide between those two sides of town. And one of the things Xander and I were sort of just talking about is that the military is one of the few places that different classes have to work together. They are part of the same team. They have exactly the same goals. And while it doesn't mean that there aren't class divides within, I mean, certainly like the enlisted officer divide, there's all sorts of issues within sort of the broader military, but it's one of the few places that you will meet and work with and engage with on a daily basis people from different classes and different educational backgrounds. And I see a little bit of that in my classrooms, but in general, academia is extremely segregated in that way. And I think that's a real problem. I mean, if you look at the people who were just flabbergasted by the outcome of the 2016 and 2024 elections, there are people like me who don't talk daily with people from very rural areas or people from very urban areas. And so, like, if you're not paying attention to what like the vast majority of Americans are dealing with and wrestling with, it's going to be really hard to understand them. So that to me is I think a really interesting thing that the military does, and I think it's a little sad that we're seeing such decreasing participation in the military, right? I mean, the rates of military participation have dropped a lot over the years. So anyway, I mean, those are just some like initial thoughts. And Dan, I don't know if you obviously have a much richer experience. I'm a uh, military spouse in a sort of weird way. And then my brother was also a Marine and or is a Marine. You never stop being a Marine.
That's true. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. Really true today. And I think and this is part of, one of the reasons that I ended up starting to write about Army 250 was a little bit of this. And I think people have just grown more disconnected from the military and maybe we're just less aware of the role that the military has long played in kind of helping cohere Americans together. I mean, I think everything from late 19th century, early 20th century, when you had these incredible migrations of mostly Europeans, but into America, World War I was one of these effects where suddenly American identity, I mean, you look at it, and it was the first time that there were Jewish rabbi chaplains, for example, at scale, and like codified and represented in a formal sense. Same thing, you go to World War II and you think about the role of women, you think of the role of Black Americans, you think about different identity groups, which have through the military kind of cohered in a unique way. And that continues to be the case. And the more disconnected we've grown from the military, I think that we've lost a little bit of that capacity to kind of recognize a shared American, or at least have a better process through which we articulate our different perspectives on what it means to be American, what we want for our country, and how we get there.
Could you say more about what you think has shifted about how we view the military and how the military interacts with American society more broadly in like post World War II?
Yeah, I mean, it's an inflection. I think we're at a really big inflection point, actually. Because you think, so 1973, the country shifted to an all-volunteer force because it's kind of coming out of Vietnam. And prior to that, and there's folks who are much more expert on this than me, but broadly speaking, America, we've had drafts before. We had very professional, small militaries for a particular time. But in the 20th century, Americans think about the Army as like World War II. World War II is the dominant kind of paradigm through which we kind of still think about the military. And that was a citizen soldier, volunteer, but also draft army. So in 1973, big switch. I think in the 70s up to the early 80s, something like 40% of American men either had served or like knew somebody who served. That number's down in the low double digits now, and it's going to track lower. So a real big shift, 1973, and gradually the military becomes much more professional. I think, trust in the military has been incredibly high for decades, persisted through the last several decades, continues to be probably the most highly trusted institution in the country. Competency, you measure it across lots of different measures. It's a very effective military in a lot of ways, but much more disconnected from society. And I think that we hit, when 9/11 happened and the war on terror, we obviously introduced something that we had not experienced in a long time. A professional military can go and fight wars like the First Gulf War, where the adversary is very, very foreign. It's in a different terrain. The impacts on society are fairly minimal. It's a very different experience when you have a war on terror, where not only did our adversary strike our own country, right, the first time since really Pearl Harbor in 1941, but now we had this sense of this fear everywhere. And so I do think the relationship with the military, it really started to experience a lot of tension in the early aughts, continuing up to today. People admired and revered the military, but also there was this very strange disconnect that emerged. The Americans' perceptions towards the military bifurcated, where we had like superhero. This was the Navy SEALs and Delta Force and special operators who could go in and were doing incredibly heroic things, but it's kind of like putting the military as superheroes. There was also a lot of imagery and concerns about that's being broken. So you had this broken savior complex happening. And I think now where we've hit another inflection point, they never really resolved. Like we didn't really come to terms with neither of those narratives is fully true. What is the more complex realities? And so I think, again, the disconnect grew wider. And then we obviously, we've hit another inflection point where, without ever kind of like going through any process to communicate this to the public, it kind of feels like the war on terror, like we don't really want to talk about it. Maybe it's done, right? We're shifting into great power competition again. It's China, it's Russia, or whomever it is. But we haven't really talked about it as a country. So I do think, again, people don't quite know what kind of wars we're orienting toward, what is the purpose of the military. So there's a lot of like continued confusion. And in that confusion, we're starting to see more polarized views towards the military. So I think that's the concerning trend that, again, I kind of in my own individual capacity, started Army 250 was like, I think I want people to feel that personal sense of connection to the military because that's one of the ways you build resilience against polarization.
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, my husband's an ROTC instructor, and we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges that he's seeing. The number of we're de-investing, and I actually don't know what's happening sort of at the top end, but we're de-investing in ROTC. Generally, we're offering fewer scholarships, which makes it harder to attract. I mean, one of the I think really powerful things about the military is that it was a really powerful force for social mobility. And certainly ROTC and ROTC scholarships were a really powerful way to draw students into higher education, for example, and give them opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. We seem to be disinvesting from those. But then there's also the fact that just demographically, the people who serve in the military now are not representative of most of the population. So there's a disconnect in terms of the vast majority of the people serving in militaries are rural and by and large, yeah, so definitely rural, lower income. And so when, and I'm in this weird place where I'm desperately trying to sort of defend academia and defend academic sort of principles on the one hand, because academia is being attacked in this sort of brutal way. But I'm also like very cognizant of the places that we have failed, like in very big ways. But if you look at, for example, the vast majority of scholars who like write about the military, or like the vast majority of like people, faculty members who talk about military engagement, none of them come from military families. None of them have served in the military. Very few of them actually know anyone who serves in the military. And that's true of political leaders as well now, increasingly. Mm-hmm. So that's a disconnect too, is we're now not like that. It used to be that everyone had a father or a grandfather who had served, and now that's just not the case anymore.
Yeah, it's really, and I think the other trend that is problematic for a whole host of reasons is one of the best predictors of somebody who's going to serve in the military is that they come from a military family. So there is this like, is it becoming a warrior class kind of thing? And it's always been part of the system. Like if you go way back, and it's always been part of every military almost in human history. But it is in a democracy, in a kind of society such as ours, like we want to have broad-based representation. We want to have the military both be like reflective of the country writ large. And I think kind of to your point, it's actually really nice when the institutions that are outside of the military have more of the military in it, right? So I think we can have a long conversation, but I think one of the ways that higher ed gets stronger is like bringing more of the military into it in a way that like is messy and complex, but also maybe necessary to figure out ways that we kind of figure out how to connect again. And I think there's ways that we can do that. We can all contribute to that as individuals, as institutional leaders.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting to kind of think about veterans and maybe some of the work you do, Dan, as being oriented towards like your military service doesn't end when you separate from the military. There's a new task that's sort of available, right? Or maybe opportunity, I should say, which is to continue to translate the U.S. military to the public. And it's interesting to think about that opportunity in academia, but also I think we're seeing a lot of veterans starting to run for office and groups encouraging them to run for office, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and there's really great groups out there. Team Rubicon is one of the best known. They organize veterans and I think other folks who are kind of in the national service space, but they go do humanitarian missions. It started abroad. I think it was the earthquake in Haiti about 15 years ago, and then also domestically. And this is a very powerful, cathartic kind of experience for veterans who get to go and really work together to go concretely deliver help and support people. But the thing again, it also has these ripple effects where you reinvigorate a part of our own civil society. It's like, oh yeah, we can do things together. We can go and actually make life better. And you think about all the spaces domestically where they have gone and helped people out in the worst kind of crises. So there's an organization, it actually just, I think, merged with the Bob Woodward Foundation, but it's literally called The Mission Continues. And it was exactly what you said, Laura, which is like, when the uniform comes off, like your service continues. And there's lots of ways you can do it, particularly at the local level. And then to the point about candidates, there's a group called With Honor, which has been around for maybe again about a decade. They do a great job trying to figure out, again, veterans of all different backgrounds and views, how do we help orient them towards the political space, but also maybe encourage and create a space where they can bring what we hope veterans would bring to our politics, which is a stronger willingness to reach out and connect across lines of difference. Hold strong political views, like don't put aside what you care about policy-wise and politically, but to recognize that at the same time we disagree about a lot, we also have a lot more in common.
Mhm. Yeah. On that more in common, you just
Speaking
you
of more in
perfectly,
common.
you
There you go,
perfectly,
next segment.
yeah,
Tried
great
that.
segue.
Tried that.
I think there's obviously we're living in a deeply polarized time. Affective polarization is growing, right? There's all sorts of research on that. But one of the things that I think the name More in Common demonstrates is that I think, and this is actually something I think about a lot when I'm sort of working my optimism muscle, is I think we do have more in common than actually separates us, even though listen to the media and all these other things you would think differently. But what do you think are some of the biggest myths? And this is both from sort of your military background, your experience with More in Common. Like, what are some of the biggest myths about the other side that you hear from both sides?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and this is again speaks to the name of this podcast and the mission, which is that most people are not primarily political. Like that is just
Mhm.
wildly true. It is
Yep.
a minority of the population who thinks about things primarily or principally through a political lens,
Mhm.
or even like even fewer through a partisan lens. Like if you were to say people whose identity as a Democrat or as a Republican is their most important identity, or even top two, say top three, very, very small. You might say, okay, what about as a conservative or as a progressive or as a liberal? They're like, okay, that's a slightly bigger slice, but it's still less than a third of the population easily. And so we had this myth on both sides that like, oh, the other side is consumed by politics,
Mhm.
only thinks about politics, and is monolithic in its composition,
Mhm.
right? Like if you are a Republican, you must believe the most extreme version of every single issue set and imaginable. And same thing, if you're a progressive, you must believe the most extreme version across every single issue set. And both those things are true. So the size of our most polarized segments is much smaller than we think. And then the kind of monolithic nature of anyone's views is much less intense than both sides think it is. And that's kind of pervasive. Like we did More in Common. One of the most notable studies More in Common did was something called the perception gap, which literally asked this question.
Mhm.
Basically, it was like, if you're a Democrat, what do you think Republicans believe on everything? Gun control, immigration, like these are issues that are high temperature, kind of controversial, large disagreement. And same thing, if you're a Republican, what do you think the average or median Democrat believes? And it's just wildly wrong, wildly wrong. And the more you actually engage in I'm going to say a kind of like pseudo politics. And by that, I mean, the more you consume political news, for example, the more
Mhm.
inaccurate your view of the other side was. I think people who actually like are on the ground doing politics, trying to solve problems, they have that more nuanced view of maybe the opposite of the other side. But most folks do not do that, right? Most folks participate in politics primarily through like sharing news, scrolling, contributing money, that kinds of stuff. And that exacerbates people's perception gaps.
Mhm.
I love the
There's a
term percent or pseudo politics. That's perfect, right? Because people do have the impression that they're being political by consuming that content and by being outraged. And it's very stark to me that like people who are political operatives, right? People who actually work in politics in some capacity, they inevitably have very nuanced views. It's so rare that I meet anybody in that space who's holds the extreme views that we're talking about getting attributed to them, right? Because it's like if you know these people, if you have to work together, again, it's tempering your view with reality and saying like, no, they aren't like you think they are.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
good. Especially true if you're in any kind of district or state, even where the politics is competitive, right? I think that,
Mhm.
and I think we'll probably come up with a lot, but in our conversation, like I think the idea of like what is good competition in politics is a really good question to be asked, because it does, like when you have this kind of healthy competition, like, oh, I really have to, if I want to win this election, or if I want to advance this legislation at whatever at the local or state level, if you're in a competitive area, you just have that experience. Like, I got to go out and persuade people. I got to go talk to people. I got to understand where they're coming from, what motivates them, what values they have. We might disagree on a lot, but how do we build that kind of commonality to advance and get the margin that you need to win? And that, I think, is the healthiest kind of competition in our
Mhm.
politics. And unfortunately, it's just increasingly, again, less common as we self-sort and as our politics become more nationalized.
Mhm. I was recently at a great presentation by the political scientist Anthony Fowler, who's at University of Chicago, and they have an article out. He and a group of co-authors. I think it was in the American Political Science Review last year, but it's basically on moderation and or just like thinking about like what political moderates look like. And one of the pervasive myths in political science, and this is where I sort of I get irritated at elites because I mean, if you look at sort of again to your point, like the people who are the most polarized are elites, they're political elites, they're academic elites, they're media elites. And the way that we think about politics trickles down into the stories that we tell about other people. And so one of the things I loved about Anthony's research was they looked at how so one of the sort of characterizations from political scientists is that people, the vast majority of Americans are what we call politically unsophisticated. And what they mean by that is that, they sort of have these like almost like random views on things, or they're not ideologically sophisticated. And they use as evidence the fact that people will hold sort of what seem to be contradictory views, like maybe someone's pro-life on abortion, but then pro-immigration on something else. And one of the things that this article points out is that, well, you actually look at how those questions are framed. And yes, when you ask a binary question, I talk a lot about binary, like sort of forced binary choices in my work. When you ask a binary question, like, are you pro-choice or pro-life? And you force people to take their really complicated thinking about abortion and stick it into those categories, yeah, you're going to get a really imperfect proxy for what they believe. And then if you ask them whether they're pro open borders or pro detention camps, you're also going to get like a really poor like understanding of what they actually believe. And so they actually did a whole host of studies just looking at like the questions we are asking as researchers are not good. And they are, in fact, not representing the way that most people are thinking about political problems. And it's a problem because then we get these myths perpetuate, not just in terms of like how the average person thinks about other average people, but the way that like elites think about the average American and their voting. And so that to me was just, it's such a neat article because it should be so obvious that like when you ask crap questions, you get crap answers. But like for some reason, that's not. Like, I don't know.
No, I mean, I really appreciate that what you just shared. And I think, and More in Common is a public opinion research organization, or is rooted in public opinion research. I led a lot of public opinion studies, and I think that they have value. But I think what you're seeing, there's a broader problem, which I think we have become, especially elites, people who are political elites, people who consume political news information most intensely, like polling data has substituted for actual like people data. And that's super problematic, right? For all the points that even if you ask really complex questions, it's like most people take polls, like they're scrolling on their phone, they're answering here. Like it's a very bad way to really understand people. I think it can give you like a flare. It can send some signals. You're like, oh, we should probe on that. I think one of the things that we did at More in Common a lot, and I think More in Common continues to do this, is like we really tried to do a lot of focus groups, a lot of qualitative stuff, like even just pushing out there, like how do we get people to come in, earn their trust, and just ask them to talk and share an experience. What are we learning about them? Not come in saying, oh, do you agree with X or Y? But just like, tell us. Like, I think one of the most interesting, one of the fun things that we did once, for example, was like, like if you had to categorize yourself or describe yourself, like what identities would you actually prioritize? Rather than saying, oh, you're a Democrat or Republican, or you're a conservative or a liberal, or even like demographics or whatever. Like we just kind of said, what do you do? And it was, again, not surprising when you step back and like, of course, it's like family identities. Oh, I'm a mom, I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a wife, I'm a grandpa, that one. Attribute identities, like I'm a good person, like I'm a good neighbor, I'm a good friend, I work hard, I'm a good listener. That's what people think about themselves primarily as. Like, that kind of orientation shows up nowhere in most political polling.
Yeah, and I can tell you from an academic career where it was my job to design basically polls, surveys in a way that would capture some phenomenon that we're trying to show in the laboratory. There's innumerable ways that you can make it so that your phenomenon doesn't appear when it actually exists, and you can make it look like it doesn't exist when it does. And it's not intentionally at all. It's just, it's as simple as if you start your survey by asking people, are you a Democrat or a Republican? You'll color all of their subsequent responses on policy. So you can prime an identity that affects your results. And so, I'm a really big fan of designing programmatic research so that you don't think a poll is the end of the story, because a poll can be representative, but that's data that is wide and not deep. And you also, likewise, you don't want to use a focus group in isolation, right? Because you could have 12 really strange people who will tell you a version of the world that nobody else shares, right? Like
Yeah.
that room full of people can come up with ideas that you can't replicate with the broader public. So you have to pair those things. You need wide and you need deep. And you really need, it's not the kind of thing that you can summarize in a headline or like these horse race things that we're tracking all the time. Oh, this person has 50, right? This person has 51% and this person has 49%. And the tiresome statistician in me says, that's not statistically significant. That doesn't matter. Stop
Right.
talking about it like it matters.
No,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, I think the lovely, interesting dynamics of a focus group are always fun. Like sometimes you'll just got like one really, whether it's charisma or something, but like one person can shape 12 people
Mhm.
in how they orient to a conversation really quickly and effectively. I mean, but to your point, I mean, I think it's just, I don't know, I've seen some of this happening more and more, but it is this the call to action, I think, for folks who want to be engaged in politics, who want to see a better version of politics, really is like to get out there, to be close
Mhm.
to communities, to gather data through the means that we have, polling, focus groups, et cetera, political data gathering tools, but to like really put a caveat on that and to be out there and having real people informing your understanding of like what's happening, what do we think is going to be, how do I engage in different communities like that? We need more of, much more of that.
Mhm.
Yeah, one of the big themes of this podcast, but also I don't know if we did this intentionally, Laura. Maybe I'll just claim we did it. We definitely did it intentionally. But people like you, people like Seth Kaplan, a lot of our guests are people who do big, right? Like you do big picture research, right? You think about big ideas. You think about pulling how all these pieces fit together. Like Seth's work on fragile states is not like he's not in the weeds on these other they're big ideas. But he always comes back to you've got to get onto the ground. Like you've got to talk to the people in those communities. You've got to talk to the people who are most affected. You've got to actually see what's happening. And so I love the idea that like you can't, it's not one or the other. You need to have those two different views. You talked, or More in Common talks a lot about the sort of exhausted majority. And so what do you, and I know Laura's work with the Independent Center, I think the growing numbers of independents, that's a great proxy for like how exhausted people are by the sort of
Yeah.
partisan dynamics. So what do you think the exhausted majority want? Why aren't they louder? And then maybe Laura can sort of jump into with some of the work that her organization has done on research on independence. But I just think that's where I see hope. And I would love to hear both of you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, and it's been great to see Laura's team build out the Independent Center. And so, just for folks who might not have heard of the term executive majority before, so More in Common, which again, a public opinion research organization, did a large study of Americans in 2018, and it used some statistical tools to create 7 different categories of Americans. It's called the Hidden Tribes. There's a report. Folks should go check it out. It's a really interesting read. And within those 7 tribes, there is this majority called the exhausted majority. So at the time, it was 67% of Americans. Throughout my tenure at More in Common, so up until 2023, we continued to do small checks, and like it held, like the exhausted majority continued to exist as far as I know, up until 2023. And the exhausted majority is kind of characterized primarily by an exhaustion with politics, the status quo politics, right? They're very, very exhausted by the affective polarization. They really dislike that political groups hate each other so much. In part because the exhausted majority are not primarily political. Right? They say they don't think about politics anywhere near as often as political elites do. Politics, they don't even like to think about politics, right? Politics is the term where like, you ask them about it and they're like, I don't want to talk about this. Like, I want to talk about sports or I want to talk about something else. So they're not political. So they're very, very exhausted by the affective polarization in our politics. They're more distrustful of political institutions. These are folks who have experienced, I would say, policy failures in a more visceral way than folks who have political elites tend to be a little bit more insulated actually from some of the downside consequences of policy failures or political failures. But the reason the exhausted majority when it comes out, and I think it is this is an optimistic story, right? Because here's a majority of Americans saying, I want something different. The reason I think it has been hard to coalesce the exhausted majority and for them to speak out on one voice is very complex policy views. This is what you were describing, Lauren, just a couple minutes ago. It's like you might have folks who are like exhausted by politics and who like have fairly strong ideological views. Like they're all in on Medicare for all. Like they want it. That's the thing that they really care about. even if they're exhausted by politics, or they might have a very conservative view on immigration, like a very intense view on immigration. So their policy views are actually quite disparate. And even within individuals, they hold policy views that don't align with either party right now. So there's no vehicle for them to go to, right? Like they might, to your point about like different, we've sorted parties intensely on issues. And a lot of the exhausted majority is like, well, I have views that are in both parties. And so what do I do? And the third is, I think in general, these are folks who don't engage with politics as regularly. And so they just don't vote. They're not prone to voting as regularly as other voters, particularly in primaries, right? Particularly in those elections where you tend to sort the candidates that in non-competitive districts go on to win. They're not active. They're not present. And so their voices are less influential relative to the folks who repeatedly and consistently show up. But again, like it's a good thing that folks vote in primaries. It's a good thing. Like I'm not critiquing the folks who show up consistently in voting, but that's part of what has been a constraint in having the exhausted majority be more influential in our politics.
I think our work at the Independent Center dovetails so closely with that. It's really interesting. When you were saying they hold views that aren't represented by either party, that is what we find about independents. And so I'm going to tell you what the two views are, and people can come yell at me in the comments. It's fiscal responsibility and it's tolerance for other people's differences. And now everybody's going to come yell and say, but Laura, the Republicans are for fiscal responsibility. And I will tell you, our audience says they are not. And I would tell you from a policy perspective, that's not fiscal responsibility if we're talking about cutting the budget by not spending on the other side, but continuing to spend on our side. And in terms of tolerance, I think that the Democratic Party has really created an issue for itself in being highly intolerant of certain types of difference. Right. And so it's hard for them to really hold that claim. And so that's what we find that independents really value, that those two things, and they're not represented. And for me, one of the reasons the work in this space is so important is because as long as this large swath of Americans are disenfranchised because political participation doesn't make sense to them, I think we will continue to have very volatile politics. And I think that volatility is going to continue to increase. And it's probably the end point is violence. And I don't think I'm being dramatic in saying that. So it's not just that we need people to be enfranchised because it's nice. We need them to be enfranchised because we need their views represented in the political process. Because to the extent that they are not, we're looking at political nihilism and volatility. And it's not a democracy can't stand like that. And so this is really like all hands on deck. We have to address this issue.
Yeah, that's such a great distillation. And I agree. There's a huge vacuum in our politics, and there's also very concerning trends. And I think we're seeing this play out in a very visceral way, right? If you were to ask me, I would say, again, I haven't done a poll in a while, but I would imagine that if you did a poll right now on like top issues for most folks, cost of living would be near the top in a very intense way. And you would think, and I would hope, like a healthy politics would respond to that by saying, how can we compete to deliver solutions that materially address the concern, right? Like we want, whether, in whatever way, offering, compete on how you do it. That's the solutions. And we're not really seeing, we're seeing that probably at the local level. Many different municipalities are trying different things. Different states are obviously trying to change more quickly to address this. Even what happened in California in housing is a version of like what might be a healthy response. But nationally, like, it has not been a major issue for a while. And so you see this kind of brokenness in certainly our national politics. And it does fuel further kind of cynicism and understandable fatigue with politics as is.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Laura.
Sorry. Well, I wanted to make sure that we got to ask Dan the parenting question because I'm super interested in his answer, both in terms of like how your work in depolarization spaces affects your parenting, but also your military and veteran experience. I think that might be a long answer. So I wanted to make sure we like throw it into the mix.
Yeah, no, that's a question about like, what does being a parent, what I learned about being a parent from the military, and I wasn't a parent when I was active duty in the
Mhm.
military. But there's like just two things that really come home to me from the military. One, enormous amount of gratitude. Like I don't dwell on this, but I reflect a lot often on the fact that like I had friends and classmates who died in Afghanistan and Iraq and across the world who never got to be parents, who never had. So it is a gift.
Mm.
Every day of being
Mhm.
a parent is a gift, and a gift that many folks I think would have been phenomenal parents and never had that opportunity. And then the second is that, not that you don't learn this only in the military, but inefficient time might be the most impactful time. Like I think there's this trend to kind
Oh.
of hyper optimize, and sometimes like the relationships build the most strongly when you're there, you're committing in an inefficient use of time to like be there for a person. They don't even quite sometimes they don't quite know why they need you there, but you're there with them, and then they need you when they need you, like you're there too. Like when somebody's having in the military, when somebody's having a serious crisis of their own family or with whatever the case might be, substance, mental health, like showing up and just being there is the impact in a very powerful way. And there's something similar to parents, right? I think we can obviously parents are super busy, a lot going on, a good parenting app, you gotta love that, all that. And yet I feel like sometimes it's the inefficient time that probably makes the
Mhm.
most difference. And then on the polarization front, I will say again, I think if I were to look out and say spots of optimism, for example, you would say, oh, I think at the national level, I think the Take It Down Act, for example, which was driven on by a lot of different parents to say, hey, we should be trying to be addressed, that there's some harms happening, particularly to young people online. Like the online world we're increasingly aware of and can feel the consequences of some of the worst features of online life. Jonathan Haidt has obviously written a whole book and started a whole movement. I think you see that parents groups, the identity of a parent is something that cuts across. And like whatever your people's views, in most ways, people really care. They want for their kids very similar things. And so it is a way that you can find, particularly at the local level, opportunities to bind folks together. It's still harder at the national level, but it's certainly something worth, for polarization purposes, something worth focusing on.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like the phrase was a non-serious answer, but hurry up and wait applies beautifully to
Yes,
the military.
yes, yes, yes. Well, and like
Uh,
some of those times up when you like talk to people, you just like figure. I
mhm.
mean, that's the enormous amount.
Yep.
I wouldn't ask or like, oh, you should really just go out and like sit on a tarmac for 6 hours in the sun because you're going to make you a better person, better relationships. But it is also true that you do bond a little bit when you're just sitting there, being like, okay, I've got nothing to do, and you just chat, you talk, you learn about each other, and you remember it 10 years later. You're like, yeah, remember that.
Mhm. Yeah.
That reminds me of Dan, the conversation, and you wrote about this on Army 250 about the Army divesting of horses. And
Okay.
some of the most irrational and inefficient years of my
Yes.
life have been spent with horses, and so I've divested personally, but I hate to see the Army going that direction because, yeah, I mean, I think like trying to deal with horses is a lot like parenting. It's kind of an exercise in insanity, but it's also deeply rewarding. It's both.
Yeah. 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 No, and I know, I don't know, we might end up talking about this in a little bit, but I think of late I've been more focused on kind of the intersections of the military and religious life. So looking at actually
Mhm.
the religious journeys and experiences of different service members across time and throughout the world, primarily US, but throughout the world. And part of it is out of what you were just talking about, where there are elements of the military, particularly as an institution, but I would also say religious institutions to hold on, where we can access and experience the sacred, which just is indefinable in efficient terms, right?
Mhm.
It's not a data driven experience. It is something where you have to almost like reject most of the prevailing trends in society and just allow ourselves to tap into something that is both ancient and continuously new. And that's the military and religion you have a unique experience in those moments. And
Mhm.
I think we need more of that. Again, there's
Mhm.
a T.S. Eliot wrote a poem in 1925 called "The Hollow Man" or "Hollow Man," not "The Hollow Man," I think. And it was about post World War I. And it leaned a lot into soldiers who were incredibly disillusioned for very understandable reasons. But it was describing the societies, and it was just talking about being hollow and kind of devoid of meaning, even while you're still moving. And there's something about that I think characterizes a little bit of our society today. This hollowness, right? We have
Mhm.
fill our days with like the temporary, the transactional, the profane in a lot of ways. And so the antidote to being hollow is to try and really rediscover that which fills us in a very kind of meaningful and transcendent manner that I think faith and the military offer unique lessons on how do we do that today.
Mhm. This is another connection, but it's a little tangential to what you just pointed out, but it relates to something Laura just said. And I actually think there are sort of connections to your last point. But one phrase we hear a lot in my house is embrace the suck. And that of course comes from the military, but also, yeah, my husband was a sort of semi-professional athlete for a long time.
Mm.
And one of the things you just have to do is you have to, like, there's periods of time that in order to do something meaningful, in order to get to something that you deeply want, it's going to suck. And you have to just embrace the suck. You have to just allow it to like envelop you and just own it, right? Like, we're just going to be here for a while. And I found that with parenting, like Laura and I have talked about this before. Like when my kids were really little, I struggled a lot. I struggled, I think the hormonal shifts were really hard, but then also just like the lack of time, the lack of sleep, like it was really hard for me to make that shift. And I think that there's a lot to be said about how we don't support parents enough. We need to, there's all sorts of things that we fail to do as a society. But I also found it very meaningful to just sort of remember, like, this is a season, right? It's a short period of time in my life. I'm doing something, I'm building something that is deeply meaningful and important to me. Am I suffering? Yes. Yes. I am suffering, right? Like, it's not easy, but it is, like, I think a lot of the most meaningful things that we do are hard. And there's a reason for that, right? There's a kind of balance that, and so that is something and I'll get on a soapbox for 2 seconds. I see a lot of students right now. I work with 18-year-olds, in class who have really struggled because they have never been asked to struggle, right? Their ways have been sort of plowed through by parents, by administrators, by teachers. They've been, instead of having to confront anxiety, they've been coddled through it. I think we see this, Jonathan Haidt has work on this as well. And so I think there is something really powerful from a parenting perspective of just asking your kids to just do hard things. And even things like caring for horses. There's a lot of like mucking out a stable is not fun, but it's a meaningful act of caring for this animal that brings deep joy to your life, that does something really important for you as a person. I don't know. So anyway, I think that to me is like a really powerful connection between some of the discipline that military life brings, but then also some of the similar kinds of lessons I want my kids to come out with. And
I'm seeing a sign in your garage that says pain is weakness leaving the body, which is also a very, very common saying in the military. No, but I think it's really true. And you look back and you look at the sociologists who studied Brits in World War II and how, like, paradoxically, it would seem during the worst of the German bombing of London, for example, people were happy. People are fired up. They look back and they're like, wow, and again, like, we don't ever want to wish that. That's not, we shouldn't seek out that. But there is something about, wow, when we do something hard, and even potentially when we suffer a little bit with other people for something that we just access parts of us that are inaccessible outside of those domains. And I think a lot of parents, a lot of well-intentioned folks in society at every level have, again, I think for virtuous reasons, actually tried to walk all off those spaces. Because like, they think about the harm and they say, no, I want you to have this life. And then you get to something like, well, actually tapping in, being present in those spaces, whether it's horses, intense athletics, intense service, like real service. Like, I think not doing politics online, but actually going out and figuring out how do I help go and do a food kitchen in my neighborhood, et cetera. Or the military, where you're doing it. You discover things about yourself and capabilities and parts of you that you would not otherwise do. I think it makes us all a little bit better individually, and then it kind of samples up in the aggregate.
It seems like there's something about efficiency that comes up in all kinds of contexts, but parenting too, right? Where you tend to be like, oh, well, I can empty the dishwasher faster than the kids. I'll just do it myself, right? And it's like robbing them of an opportunity to do something that is not on its face meaningful, but is part of a larger like life that's meaningful. And I wonder if some of the things that people think of in the military as being inefficiencies, they are inefficiencies, but like they're not, that doesn't mean we need to eradicate all of them.
Yeah. And again, I can hear 18-year-old Dan I was like doing hours of parade drill in like very hot weather in the summer. West Point, you wear like this heavy wool uniform. Being like, this is I don't want to be like, oh, let's all go out and spend time marching around in a square. And yet at the same time, I do viscerally. I remember that, and we all and I remember at reunions and whatnot. Like those are experiences that they build something, and you don't quite know. Until we've lost it, sometimes we don't really know actually which of those things
Yeah.
has meaning, has the power to actually like, oh wow, help us find a better version of ourselves, a more full version of ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have about 2 minutes left. And one of the things we like to ask our guests is, what are you feeling hopeful about right now? Or what are you feeling optimistic about? Yeah, what can you give our listeners that will pick us up?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to say something that, again, folks in the comments should weigh in and be like, no, this is going to be a disaster. Who knows? But I am genuinely excited for 2026 and the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I think that there's all the potential in the world for it to be hyper politicized and polarized in certain spheres of life, and yet at the like local level, I see so many communities, so many states, so many nonprofits, so much of civil society, from businesses all the way to churches, organizing to do interesting things, to tell parts of our
Yeah.
history in a novel way, to invite folks to kind of experience again, like what this shared journey that we're all on as Americans. And it is a moment to really reflect on like, wow, 250 years. Like I think the founders were pretty optimistic on one level, but like, I don't think that they also were like, maybe this thing blows up when we lose and so there is something precious about that. And, I think just to close on my last reflection about some of the stuff I've been working on in the military, there's this very beautiful page out of a book. It's on the Korean War, and it's about the POWs and they're returning. It's September 1953, and they're coming into SF, San Francisco Bay, and it's a very dreary, foggy day, as is common in the Bay Area, and yet the POWs are on the deck, and the kind of intercom comes on and says, "Hey, look up, keep your eyes pointed towards the city," and an Air Force band strikes up "God Bless America," and the fog rolls back, and they see the Golden Gate Bridge. And this debt recalls like all these hard warriors are in tears, coming home, right? And so 26 is one of those moments. Not that we're all going to have this kind of incredible emotional experience, but it is an opportunity to remind us that this is home in the most powerful, deep sense of that word.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that my husband and I were just on a trip. Sorry, I need to plug in my phone. But we were just on a long road trip, and we ran across an autobiography of, speaking of the 250th, of the Marquis de Lafayette. And he is one of these incredible, I actually think that like one thing that we can all do to like celebrate the 250th is read this guy's autobiography in terms of just like the deep principles. Like, I mean, he was this French aristocrat who like gave up his super cushy aristocratic life to come to the US and like participate in the revolution because he cared about human freedom. And he cared about human freedom enough to like push back on Washington and other, like, he's like, you guys shouldn't be owning slaves. Like, why do you guys own slaves? Like, I mean, but he managed to do it in a way that didn't alienate people. I mean, he was just a national hero. I didn't realize, I had never put it together, that all the Fayettevilles across the United States, like there's tons of Fayettevilles are named after him. But in terms of like deep patriotism, like it's like patriotism for humanity is like what he, like, it was like a deep love of other humans that he sort of embodied. And he suffered for it. Like he spent 5 years in a French prison. Like, I mean, this guy was not like, he was wounded multiple, like, I mean, it was not an easy life, but so anyway, in terms of like, obviously like there's tons of founding fathers that are also worth reading about, but I don't know, I was just fascinated by someone who I had not read of him before. And he was just incredible. So yeah.
Totally. No, yeah, I think he's one of the great figures that we can lift up in 2026, at all times, but for 2026 in particular. And I found out there's a guy who does Lafayette reenactments like professionally across the country, and it's kind of like, no, again, one of the wonderful things about America. So many people doing amazing things that are happening all the time.
Yeah.
And inefficient.
Inefficient.
Like, why reenact Lafayette?
Yeah,
but
He might have a horse too. I think he has a horse. So like all the things that we've been talking,
all the things are tied
coming
together. Yeah, it's not efficient. It is meaningful. And something else that Lauren and I have talked about on this podcast for the 4th of July episode, like sometimes the person who understands and translates America the best is not an American. And so I think that's such an interesting example of Lafayette. And
Mhm.
We talked about Aaron Copland, the music of Aaron Copland, and I'm sure there are a lot of other examples of, where outsiders are showing us what we really are when we're being our best selves.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Laura, is there anything you're hopeful about this week that you want to, before we?
I I will my hopefulness is not quite as good as Dan's, but I'll put a plug in. I've just come back from New York. The Met has an exhibit of the painter John Singer Sargent, and it is as delightful as everybody said. And if you can get to it, you should go have a look. You only have until August 1st. All hands call, but it is a wonderful study of somebody recognizing their talent and what they're supposed to be doing, and you see it in pictures as you walk
Mhm.
through this particular exhibit. You see his painting evolve, and it's very visible and present, and you see him also like persevering through a lot of really nasty critique as well, personal critique. Despite the fact that like today we recognize him as probably the most important portraitist of American painting. And
Yeah.
so it was kind of like a different way of using my brain that was delightful and exciting and motivating. So I'm
Nice.
still coasting off of that.
Awesome. Awesome. I just got back from vacation, so I was actually in Europe. Say no more. We were wandering around the Alps in Austria and northern Italy and Slovenia. Actually, Ljubljana, for those Slovenia was never on my like top 10 list of like places to go. But Ljubljana is just this absolutely beautiful city, delightful people. It's not overrun by tourists, but it's just a really, really beautiful European city with lots of history. I mean, that interesting sort of that history of the sort of beautiful historical architecture combined with like these random Soviet style buildings like plopped in the middle of things. And, a lot of like deep history there that I think is pretty fascinating. But so I'm still coasting off that. That's yeah. But I think what I'm optimistic about is just these conversations. I think I always
Mhm.
feel better after talking to people like Dan. So thank you for
Yeah,
spending so
same.
much time with us this week.
That's great.
Where can people find you? What would you like people to know as we close out today?
Yeah, so it'd be great if folks want to check out army250.us. That's the kind of subset that I work on. I'm focused on the Army and American society. And then otherwise, just, danvallone.com. Easy to learn more about the work that I do, consulting, speaking, writing, all those things.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Well,
Thank
thank you,
you. Yeah.
Dan.
Thank you both. This is great.
You've been listening to We Made This Political with Laura Forcum and Lauren Hall. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The podcast Substack is We Made This Political. Laura's Substack is How to Human, and Lauren's Substack is The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. Subscribe and share if you like what you hear, and please also rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. That really, really helps other people find our work and means a lot to us too. Thanks for listening.